You can watch us every day. We are adding a new story every day at 8 a.m. Feel free to write a comment of a feedback. The day Aldrich Feastone rode out of Ashenmore Keep, he told himself he was doing her a kindness.
Feel free to check out our other
This was the
videos or
story
YouTube
men told
channels
when they
where you
left,
can find more
that
interesting
the leaving
stories.
was practical,
Your feedback in the
necessary,
comments means
in
a
some
lot to
technical
us.
sense for the person being left. He had a territory to govern. He had border disputes that required his physical presence, pack councils that could not convene without the Alpha King at the head of the table. These were true things. He arranged them in a row in his mind, like stones across a river, and walked across them, and did not look at the water between. What he did not tell himself, because some part of him was honest even when honesty was inconvenient, was that standing in Sable Renoir's room on his 8th morning in the keep had been an experience he was not equipped to repeat without feeling something he had decided not to feel. She had been sleeping when he came in, or not sleeping. The distinction mattered, and he'd taken a moment to understand it. She was lying very still with her eyes closed in the way of someone who has learned that stillness conserves what shallow breathing costs, and when she heard him she opened her eyes and looked at him with the particular steady attention of someone who has been waiting for whatever comes next and has decided to meet it without flinching. She was 23. She had the Renoir gray eyes, and the Renoir family's good bones, and a chest condition that her father had described in the arrangement documents as a mild tendency toward respiratory difficulty in cold seasons, which was to say, she was ill in November, and Ashenmore Keep sat at an elevation where November began in September and lasted until April. She had looked at him, and he had explained the parliamentary demands and the border councils and the necessity of his return to the capital, and she had said, "I understand. I'll manage the keep in your absence. Not please stay. Not what should I do. I'll manage the keep." He had not known what to do with that, and the not knowing had made him want to leave faster, and so he had. He left before breakfast. The first letter arrived from Ashenmore in December, which was 3 weeks later than he'd expected any communication, and considerably shorter than he'd expected when it came. Lord Aldrich, the monthly household accounts are enclosed. Expenditures this period include timber delivery, 2 roof repairs in the East Wing, and the hiring of 4 household staff. I have Fenwick's confirmation of all amounts. The physician Ostler has seen me twice, and considers my condition stable. Sable. He read it in his study in the capital, with the parliamentary reports stacked on one side of the desk and the border council summaries on the other, and he read it twice. I'll manage the keep. She had, apparently, not been speaking loosely. His reply was efficient and brief, as hers had been, approval of the expenditures, confirmation of the monthly account transfer. He included a line noting that Dr. Ostler was reliable, which was information she hadn't asked for, and which he sent anyway. He put the letter in the correspondence file with the others from the Northern Territories and went back to the parliamentary reports. He did not think about her again for a week. This was, he later understood, the beginning of the period during which he thought about her, without quite admitting he was doing it. The parliamentary session was genuinely demanding. The land reform debate had fractured along lines he hadn't anticipated, and his presence was required in 3 caucuses simultaneously, which was physically impossible and politically non-negotiable, and required the kind of careful fractured attention that left very little room for anything else. And yet, when the January letter arrived from Ashenmore, he read it before he read the morning's border summaries. The northeast tower staircase had a rotted support which has been replaced. The kitchen garden has been planned for spring, and seeds ordered from the Caldwell merchant. Fenwick wishes to note that the boundary survey records from last century appear to be misfiled in the General Estate Archive rather than the boundary records. I have not yet reviewed them fully, but Fenwick considers it worth flagging. My chest is better than December. The fires are adequate. Sable. Misfiled boundary records. He stared at this line for a longer moment than the others. The Ashenmore boundary dispute with the Eastern Pack territories had been simmering for 4 years. His legal advisors had told him twice that the supporting documentation was insufficient. He had accepted this because his legal advisors were not wrong about many things, and the dispute was not the most urgent of his problems. He wrote back, "If you have time to review the boundary records, I would be interested in your findings." He sent the letter before he thought about whether this was an appropriate thing to ask of a woman who was also managing a household in poor condition while ill in a northern winter. The response arrived in February, and it was the longest letter she had sent. It was also, he thought, reading it in his study with the parliamentary reports for once left where they were, the most interesting letter he had received in 4 years of correspondence with people whose job was to send him interesting letters. She had found something. The Ashenmore boundary dispute, as Sable's letter explained with the methodical clarity of someone who organized information before communicating it, rested on a territorial agreement from 80 years ago. The agreement had been documented. The problem was that the documentation referenced a secondary survey conducted 20 years prior, which established the original boundary line, and this survey had never been formally integrated into the boundary records. It had been filed, correctly, at the time, in the General Estate Archive under the name of the surveyor, a man called Bren, who had died the same year he conducted the survey, whose estate had been absorbed into the keep's records without a proper index, and whose survey therefore existed, but had been invisible to every legal advisor who had searched the boundary records specifically, and found nothing. Sable had found it because she had been going through the General Archive in order, from the beginning, because the archive was misfiled, and she had decided to refile it correctly, and she had come across Bren's survey on a Thursday afternoon in January, because it came after Breckenridge, a wool merchant, 1743, and before Brierley, a land lease, 1751, in the alphabetical chaos of a filing system that had not been organized with legal research in mind. The survey established the original boundary line clearly and unambiguously in Ashenmore's favor. With it, the 4-year dispute resolved. Aldrich read the letter 3 times. Then he wrote back, "Send me the document reference and I will have the legal team review it. This may be exactly what was missing. How did you know to refile the archive from the beginning?" Her reply, "The archive was misfiled. Misfiled things cannot be found reliably, which means they cannot be used. I have time in the evenings." He sat with this for a long moment. He thought about a woman with a chest condition, in a cold northern manor, spending her evenings systematically refiling decades of disorganized records. Not because anyone had asked her to, not because it would be noticed, because a misfiled archive was a problem, and problems, when you had time and attention, were for solving. He told himself this was simply useful. He told himself this warmth in his chest when he read her letters was the practical satisfaction of receiving good information from an unexpected source. He was not entirely convincing, even to himself. March brought a thaw, and with it, a letter from his sister Nessa. Nessa was 42, managed her own estate with the efficiency of a small military operation, and had opinions about everything she delivered without preamble. The letter was nominally about a family matter, a cousin's bonding arrangement, but contained, midway through the 2nd page, the following. "I am told the Vale woman is still at Ashenmore. I confess I am surprised. The expectation in the family was that she would find the isolation untenable and return to her father. Instead, I hear she has hired a carpenter, resolved a boundary dispute, and holds a staff dinner every Sunday that apparently the entire village looks forward to. I am not telling you what to do. I am telling you that if you intend to come back to Ashenmore at any point, you should perhaps do it soon, before you arrive to find it completely unrecognizable." Aldrich read this letter twice, and then a 3rd time, not because the words were complicated, but because they kept producing thoughts he hadn't finished with. A staff dinner every Sunday. He had left Ashenmore in November with 3 staff. Fenwick, an aging groundskeeper, and a part-time kitchen girl who had been miserable about the cold. He had not thought to hire more, because he had not thought anyone would stay long enough for more staff to be useful. He wrote back to Nessa, "I return in May. The parliamentary session ends at month's end." Then he sat at his desk for a long time, doing nothing in particular, which was unusual enough that his secretary knocked to check whether he needed anything. He did not need anything. He was trying to form a clear picture of what he was going to find when he got there, and the picture kept refusing to stay still. He arrived on a Thursday in early May, unannounced. He had intended to send word ahead, practical, courteous, the sort of thing that gave a household time to prepare. He had not sent word ahead, and he was being honest with himself about why. He wanted to see what it looked like when it was not prepared for him. He wanted to see the manor the way Sable lived in it. He came through the outer gate mid-afternoon, and the first thing he noticed was the sound. Ashenmore in November had been a quiet that was more absence than peace. The silence of unoccupied rooms, of staff who had contracted to match a dying household. The sound he heard now was not loud, not festive. Simply inhabited, voices in the yard, a hammer somewhere in the east wing, the particular rhythm from the kitchen below the main floor that meant something actual was being cooked. The second thing he noticed was the gate lodge. It had been empty in November. The groundskeeper slept in the main building, which he had explained to Aldrich with the vagueness of someone who had stopped being accountable. The gate lodge now had a light in its window, and a neat stack of split firewood against the outer wall, and a boot scraper beside the door that was new. He rode through and into the main yard, and a boy of perhaps 14 came from the stable without being summoned, took the reins with the practiced ease of someone who knew what he was doing, and said, "Shall I take your saddlebag in, my lord?" Aldrich did not recognize the boy. He said yes. He walked to the main door of the keep. The door was the same oak he remembered, but someone had oiled the hinges and replaced the bolt mechanism, and added a brass handle that caught the May afternoon light. Small things. The kind of things that said, someone was paying attention. Fenwick answered the door, and did not look surprised to see him, which meant either Fenwick had seen him come through the gate, or Fenwick had developed some quality of serenity about unexpected events over the winter that he had not previously possessed. Given that it was Fenwick, Aldrich suspected the former. "My lord," Fenwick said, and then, with the specific inflection of a man who has learned something new and was still deciding how he felt about it, "Lady Sable is in the library." Aldrich thought he had misheard. The library. West Wing, my lord. She had it unlocked in January. He had been in Ashenmore for 6 months before his marriage, to prepare the keep for occupancy, and he had walked past the West Wing library door twice a day, and not once opened it. He had not unlocked it because it had been locked when his father died, and he had not thought about it. Sable had, apparently, thought about it. He told Fenwick he would find his own way, and walked through the entrance hall. The entrance hall was different. He catalogued it as he walked. The rugs he did not remember. The fire, a coat stand near the door with 3 coats on it that were not his, a bowl on the side table with dried flowers from, he looked at them, the garden outside, which was not the garden he remembered. The garden he remembered had been a muddy approximation with the remains of summer planting no one had tended. He went to the west wing. The library door was open. Light came from inside, afternoon light through the western windows, and lamplight from the table, and the smell of old books and a wood fire, and, underneath both, the faint smell of the dried herbs that someone had put in a small dish on the windowsill, which was a detail so specific and domestic that it stopped him in the doorway. Sable was at the central table, bent over something, her hair pinned up in the efficient way he'd seen in November, not decorative, simply out of her face. She was writing, and she had not heard him, and he stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at what she had made of his locked library. The shelves were organized. Not the chaos he dimly remembered from the few times he'd been in before his father locked it. Books standing properly, like signs to themselves. There were maps on the boards along the east wall, mounted carefully, with small written labels at the corners. The fireplace had a new iron bracket he didn't recognize. The table where she was working had 3 separate stacks of documents organized by some system he couldn't immediately decode. She looked up. He had forgotten, and this seemed, standing here, like an extraordinary thing to have forgotten, the specific quality of her attention. She did not startle, and she did not perform not startling. She simply looked, with the gray eyes and the steadiness he remembered from November, and gave him a moment to be in the room before she expected anything of him. "You didn't send word," she said. "I wanted to see it as it was." She looked at him for a moment, and he thought she understood what he meant by that, though she didn't say so. She set down her pen and straightened. "The east wing is repaired," she said. "The boundary survey is in the 3rd folder from the left, ready for your legal team. The household accounts are current. There's a staff dinner on Sunday if you're staying." She paused. "Are you staying?" "Yes," he said. She nodded once, with the practicality he was remembering piece by piece. "I'll tell Bet. She takes numbers seriously, and she'll want to plan." He moved further into the library. He stopped at the nearest map, a territorial survey he didn't recognize the date of, carefully mounted, with a notation in the corner that said, "Compare to 1731 boundaries, eastern tributary," in her small handwriting. "The watercourse," she said, from the table. "There's a boundary question about the eastern tributary, separate from the Bren survey. Less clear. I haven't resolved it yet." How long have you been working on it? Since February. She looked at the map with the expression of someone regarding an ongoing project. The relevant records are across 3 different archive sections. I've found 2 of the 3. The third should be in the general land records somewhere around the 1690s, but the 1690s are the worst organized section of the whole archive. He looked at her. How much of the archive have you gone through? Everything from 1700 forward, she said. The pre-1700 records are more fragile. I've been more cautious there. He thought about the 6 months since November, about the parliamentary session, which had been difficult and consuming, and which had taken all of his professional attention, and which he had given every hour of long days to, because that was what was required. And she had spent those 6 months, ill, alone, in a cold manor that had been empty for years, going through his archive decade by decade. Why? He said. She looked at him. The archive was misfiled. Problems that can be fixed should be fixed. You didn't have to do this. I had time, she said, and the archive was useful. Every letter you sent me was about accounts or formal matters, but you're governing a territory, and territory governance requires knowing what's in the records. I thought. She stopped, and he had the impression this was unusual, her stopping mid-thought. I thought it might be useful when you came back. The words landed with a weight that exceeded their literal content. When you came back, not if, not with any particular emphasis on the certainty or the hope, simply the assumption, stated plainly, that he would return. Did you think I would? He said. It's your territory, she said. Of course you'd come back. He sat down in the chair across from her. The library's chairs were old leather, the kind that absorbed decades of use and became more useful with each one. He sat in it, and it felt like what good chairs felt like when a room was properly heated. Tell me about the Sunday dinners, he said. She looked at him with a slight shift of expression, not quite surprise, more like adjustment. Bet was cooking for the household, and there was more food than people, she said. I invited the carpenter and his apprentice, who'd been working on the roof. Then it became regular. The staff's families come. In winter it was practical. People weren't isolated in their cottages. In spring, she paused. In spring, it's something people look forward to. How many people? It varies, 12 to 18, generally. She glanced at him. You're wondering if it's appropriate for the Alpha King's household. I'm wondering who thought of it, he said. I did, she said. Though Bet planned most of the food, and Merritt, the household manager, she arrived in February, organized the rotation. It stopped being mine fairly quickly. Things that are useful tend to find their own momentum. He looked at the library, at the organized shelves and the maps on the boards, and the small dish of herbs on the windowsill. Nessa wrote to me, he said, in March. A brief pause. What did she say? That you had hired a carpenter, resolved a boundary dispute, and held a staff dinner every Sunday that the village looked forward to. He met her eyes. She suggested I return before the keep was completely unrecognizable. Sable looked at the table. Is it unrecognizable? He looked at the room, at the fire, which the library had never had when he was a boy, because his father had decided books and open flames were an inadvisable combination, though the bracket she'd installed suggested she'd solved that problem practically. At the maps on the boards, the organized archive, the herbs on the windowsill, the specific quality of a room that had been used. Genuinely used, not displayed. No, he said. It's recognizable. Just, he paused, finding the word, more itself than it was. She was quiet for a moment, and he watched her absorb this, watched the small, contained quality of her face process something, and file it. I've been reading the territorial histories, she said, while I worked on the archive. For context, she looked at the shelves. There was a period in the 1740s when Ashenmore was apparently the most prosperous pack settlement in the Northern Territories. 3 generations of good management in succession. The histories are a bit valedictory about it. A pause. I found I wanted to understand what it was before. What it could be. He looked at her. You've been thinking about what this place could be. She met his eyes. I've been here since November, she said. Of course I have. He found Bet in the kitchen before dinner, because Fenwick had mentioned that Bet was the person who would tell him the most honest account of the winter, and this turned out to be accurate. Bet was 50, compact, with the hands of someone who had cooked for 30 years, and the manner of someone who was efficient, because she had decided efficiency was more useful than warmth, and who turned out to have plenty of warmth underneath the efficiency, once she'd decided someone deserved it. She told him about the firewood crisis in December, solved in 2 days. She told him about the roof, and Dow the carpenter, and Ren the 14-year-old who had become, over the winter, legitimately skilled at stonework. She told him about the kitchen garden plan and the boundary records and the Sunday dinners, and she told him all of it in the specific tone of someone reporting on an operation they are proud of. She was ill in December, Bet said. Bad week. Didn't want anyone to know, which we all knew anyway because that's how it works. Kept working from bed. Merritt had to bring her the archive boxes. She looked at him with the directness of a woman who has decided something about a person and is now communicating it. She never complained, not once, not about the cold or the illness or the fact that this place was in a state. She just worked out what needed doing and did it. He was quiet. The Sunday dinners were her idea, Bet continued, but she doesn't run them anymore. They run themselves. That's the mark of something done right, when it doesn't need the person who started it anymore. She looked at him. She's been building things that last. All winter. I thought you should know that. He thought about November, and the 8 days before he left, and the morning he had come to her room and seen her in the bed with the account books, and felt, watching her, something he had not been equipped to deal with and had therefore solved by leaving. He thought about a woman who had watched him ride out and had said, "I'll manage the keep," and had proceeded to do exactly that, not as a performance of capability, not to make any argument about who she was, but simply because the keep needed managing, and she was there, and it was practical. He had spent 6 months in the capital doing necessary things. She had spent 6 months at Ashenmore doing necessary things. He had sent her brief letters about accounts. She had sent him brief letters about accounts, and also found the document that resolved a 4-year legal dispute, and reorganized an archive that had been misfiled for 50 years, and built a Sunday dinner that 12 to 18 people attended because they genuinely wanted to. He had been governing a territory. She had been making a home. He had not understood, until standing in Bet's kitchen on a May evening, that these were different activities with different results, and that he had been doing only one of them for 6 months and feeling, in the way he had not fully admitted, the lack of the other. The Sunday dinner was warm and loud and had nothing formal about it. He sat at the long table with Fenwick and Bet and Merritt and Dow and Wren and 7 others whose names he learned across the course of the meal, and he said less than everyone else at the table and listened more, and the conversation moved around him with the ease of something that had been doing this long enough not to need managing. Sable sat at the far end, not because she was separated from him, but because that was her usual seat, he gathered, the position she occupied when she was not the most important person at the table and did not need to be. He watched her across the dinner, the small exchanges with the people around her, the way she registered each person's words with the full attention she gave most things, and he thought about the 8 mornings in November when he had eaten breakfast alone in the formal dining room, because the formal dining room was where the Duke ate, and she had eaten in her sitting room because she was not well enough to come down, and they had spent 8 days in the same building and barely occupied the same space. After dinner, in the hall, with the household dispersing in the comfortable way of people ending an evening rather than a performance, she came to stand beside him, not pointedly. She was going to the stairs, and he was near the stairs, and she stopped. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "If you want to see the full archive situation, the 1690s section I haven't resolved, it would help to have someone else look at it. Fresh eyes on misfiling problems are useful." He looked at her. "You're asking me to help with the archive." "You know the territory better than I do," she said. "The 1690s records may reference locations or people you'd recognize." He thought about parliamentary reports and border council summaries and the 6 months of efficient correspondence they had maintained, and he thought about how much less interesting all of it seemed than a library with organized shelves and an unsolved mystery in the 1690 misfiling. "After breakfast," he said. She nodded, moved toward the stairs. "Sable." She stopped, turned. He had not planned what he was going to say. He had been planning a great many things in 6 months, and none of them had prepared him for this, for standing in the hall of a manor he had left in poor condition and finding it inhabited, genuinely inhabited, by someone who had no particular obligation to care about it, and had cared about it enormously. "The archive," he said. "The history you've been reading. The boundary records." He paused. "The Sunday dinners." She waited. "I didn't expect this," he said, "when I left." "I told you I would manage," she said. "You said you would manage," he agreed. "I thought that meant maintaining, keeping it from getting worse." She looked at him with the gray eyes and the steadiness that he had been thinking about. He now admitted to himself, far more than was practical, for someone he had sent brief monthly letters to. "Things that are maintained but not improved," she said, "generally get worse anyway. The deterioration is slower, but it's still deterioration." She paused. "I thought that was worth avoiding." He looked at her. "Is that how you thought about this place? As something to improve?" She was quiet for a moment, not evasive, thoughtful, the way she was when she was being precise about something. "I thought about it as something that had been good once and could be good again," she said. "The histories made that clear. And I was here, and had time, and—" another pause. "And I live here." It seemed worth caring about. The hall was quiet around them, the fire on the west side, the coats on the stand by the door, the bowl of dried flowers on the side table. "I want to stay," he said. It came out more directly than he'd planned, but he was past the point of managing the thing carefully. She looked at him. "In the territory," he said. "I've been running the pack governance from the capital for 6 years, because the administrative apparatus is there. But the governance of Ashenmore—" He stopped, finding the honest version. "The governance of Ashenmore has been happening without me, and I think it's been happening better than when I was managing it at a distance." "Fenwick is competent," she said carefully. "Fenwick is competent," he agreed. "And you are something I don't have a clean category for. You arrived here and you built something, not because I asked you to, not because it was required. You found the misfiled archive and the unsolved boundary, and the household that needed staff, and the kitchen that needed a bet, and you simply—" He stopped. She was watching him, waiting, with the specific patience of someone who does not fill other people's silences before they're ready. "I want to be here for it," he said, "for what it becomes. I want to have the Sunday dinners and know the names of Dow's apprentice, and find out what's in the 1690 records and—" He stopped again. "And I want to stop writing you letters about accounts." The hall held the specific quality of a moment that was doing something. She looked at him, and the gray eyes were doing several things he could not fully read, and then she said, very quietly, "The 1690 records have been bothering me since March." He almost laughed. It was not the response he had expected, and it was, somehow, exactly right. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "After breakfast," she said. "Bet takes punctuality seriously." "I've heard." She turned toward the stairs, stopped once more, with her hand on the newel post, not quite looking back. "It is good," she said, "that you're staying." Then she went up. He stood in the hall for a moment. The fire, the coats, the flowers, the sound of the kitchen below, Bet and Merritt finishing the evening's work with the comfortable efficiency of people who know their work well and do not need to perform it. He thought about all of it, about the long winter he had not been here for, and the manor that had been remade in his absence, not into something foreign, but into something that finally resembled what it had always been capable of being. He thought about a woman who had said, "I'll manage," and had meant something so much larger than he'd understood, and who had spent 6 months building things that lasted, and who had found the document that resolved a 4-year dispute, and spent her evenings refiling an archive, and held Sunday dinners for 12 to 18 people, and had, in doing all of it, made Ashenmore into the kind of place he had not known he was looking for, until he stood in it, and felt, for the first time in a long time, that he was actually somewhere. He went to the study, his study, but different now, tidied without being emptied of character, the fire laid and burning, and sat at the desk. He did not open any of the parliamentary reports he had brought with him. Instead, he sat in the quiet of the keep for a long time, listening to it breathe, the fire, the last sounds of the kitchen, the wind across the north tower that he had not heard in months, and thought that the thing he had left for, and the thing he had come back to, were not the same thing, and that this was entirely his own making, and that the best he could do about it now was to be present for what came next. He was staying. Tomorrow there would be breakfast, and the archive, and the 1690 records that had been bothering her since March. It seemed, he thought, like a reasonable place to begin. The 1690 records yielded their secret on the second morning. He found it, not her, which she noted with the expression of someone updating an accounting she had been keeping, in a folder that had been misfiled under the name of a steward, rather than the land it concerned, because the steward had apparently signed everything, and the filing had been organized by signatory, rather than subject, which was a decision that had made sense to someone in 1693, and to no one since. The folder contained the original watercourse survey. Not only that, it contained the secondary agreement between the then Alpha of Ashenmoor and the neighboring pack, which established shared water rights and defined the specific tributary boundaries in a way that was clear, witnessed, and had been sitting in the wrong drawer for 130 years. Sable looked at it when he put it on the table, looked at it for a long moment with the expression he was learning was her version of something he would have called relief. The eastern tributary, she said. Clearly Ashenmoor, he confirmed. The 1693 agreement is explicit. The shared rights cover the main course only, and the eastern branch is excluded by name. She looked at him. You found it in the steward's folder. The steward signed it, he said. Whoever filed it organized by signatory. A pause. I've been through every subject category twice, she said. I went through the land records 3 times. I never thought to check the steward's personal correspondence file. You would have found it eventually. Eventually, she agreed. You found it in 2 mornings. I know the territory's history better than you did when you started, he said. The steward's name, Carrick, I recognized it. He was involved in most of the major land arrangements of that period. My father mentioned him. When I saw the folder, I thought it was worth checking. She looked at the document. That's 2 boundary questions resolved, she said. The Bren survey, and now this. In 6 months of archive work, he said. The archive was a problem, she said. Problems that can be fixed should be fixed. He had heard this reasoning before, in her February letter. He thought about it differently now, sitting across from her in the library, with the morning light coming through the western windows, and the fire in the bracket she'd had built. What made you start with the archive? He said, in particular. She was quiet for a moment, organizing her answer the way she seemed to organize most things, into the clearest possible form before delivering it. The first week, she said, I was in bed a great deal, which I disliked, and Fenwick was uncertain about my authority to do most things, which I understood, but also found frustrating. The archive was something I could do without Fenwick's cooperation, and without needing to be vertical. She paused. Also, I wanted to understand where I was. I'd been brought to a place I didn't know, and the archive was the record of that place. Everything that had happened here was in those boxes. She looked at the shelves. I thought if I understood the history, I would understand the territory, and if I understood the territory, I would understand what it needed. He looked at her. And did you understand what it needed? More than it had, she said. Fires, a roof that doesn't leak, staff who are paid on time and treated with consistency. She paused. A kitchen that produces food, a library that's open. Another pause, smaller. People who come on Sunday evenings because they want to. He thought about what Bet had said in the kitchen. She's been building things that last. When I left in November, he said, I told myself it was practical, that the parliamentary session and the border councils required my presence. She looked at him steadily, not accusatory, simply present. They did require it, she said. Yes, he agreed. And I also was not. He stopped. He was being precise, which required care. I was not comfortable with what I had found here. You were ill, and the manor was in poor condition, and I had married someone I didn't know during a period when I was still. He stopped again. She waited. My first mate died 11 months before our wedding, he said. The arrangement with your family had been in progress before she was ill. When she died, the families decided to proceed because the territorial alliance was... I know, she said. I was told. What you were told, he said carefully, was probably the political version. She looked at him, waiting. Vera died in September. The wedding was in November. Everyone agreed it was sensible to proceed. The alliance was important, the arrangement was solid, the delay had already been longer than originally planned. He looked at the map on the board beside the window, the 1730 territorial survey, with her small handwriting in the corner. I agreed, because they were not wrong about any of it, and because— he paused. Because staying still in Ashenmoor after she died had been very difficult, and having a practical reason to be elsewhere was, I think, something I wanted. He had not said this to anyone. He was saying it in a library in May to a woman he had left in November, and it was accurate and it was overdue. Sable was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of discomfort, the quiet of someone receiving information carefully. I wondered, she said, finally. I wasn't certain. There was enough genuine political reason for the arrangement that it was possible everything was exactly what it was presented as. Most of it was, he said. The political reason was real. The alliance matters. He looked at her. I just also needed to be somewhere else, and I told myself that was the same as the political reason. She nodded. Once. Not forgiving, more like confirming a diagnosis. She had suspected, and was now confirmed, and was filing accordingly. The Manor needed someone, she said. Regardless of why you went, it needed someone, and I was here. You were here, he said. And you, he gestured at the room, at the winter's work sitting around them. You made it into somewhere that needed someone permanently. She looked at him, the gray eyes, steady. Is that what you're saying? That you want to be here? I'm saying I want to be here, he confirmed. Not as an alternative to the capital. I'll still govern from here. The territorial administration can be reorganized. Godric has been suggesting this for years, and I've been deflecting because— he stopped. Because Ashenmoor didn't feel like a place to govern from. It felt like a place to manage from a distance. And now, he looked at the library. The 400 organized books, the maps on the boards, the fire in the bracket, the herbs on the windowsill, the 2 documents on the table that resolved 2 boundary disputes that had cost the pack 4 years of unresolved tension. Now it feels like the place that has the information, he said. Something moved in her expression, small, the kind of small that was not insignificant. The 1730 map, she said, after a moment. I've been comparing it to the 1680 version. There's a discrepancy in the southeastern corner that I haven't been able to account for. It might be another misfiling problem, or it might be a surveyor error. He looked at the map board. Where specifically? The valley section, she said. Here. She stood and came around the table and pointed, and he came to stand beside her at the board, and she explained the discrepancy with the clear attention she brought to explaining most things, and he looked where she pointed and thought about the southeastern corner of the territory, and the history he knew that she was still learning. There was a boundary adjustment in 1698, he said. I don't know if it would have been in the archive. It may have been a local agreement that was documented at the county level, rather than the estate level. She looked at him. The county records. I haven't touched them in years, he said. They're at the county seat, about a day's ride. She turned back to the map. He watched her look at it, at the discrepancy she'd been sitting with since she found it, and he watched her file the new information, county records, day's ride, and reorganize around it. When you go, she said, I'd like to come. He looked at her. Your chest is better in spring, she said. Dr. Osler confirmed last week. A day's ride in May is not a winter crossing. She met his eyes. I've been solving these questions from secondary sources all winter. The county records would let me resolve several things I've had to leave open. He thought about the woman who had worked from bed in January, so the archive boxes could be brought to her, who had organized a household while ill in the cold, who had decided that the territory was worth understanding and had spent 6 months doing exactly that. The county seat, he said. We'll take the eastern road. It's faster in spring. She looked at the map, then at him. After the Sunday dinner, she said. Monday. Monday, he agreed. She went back to the table and sat down and picked up her pen and made a note in the small notebook she kept beside the current document stack, and he watched her do it with the precise economy of someone who has been keeping her own records all winter and knows exactly what system she uses. He pulled the chair across from her and sat down and picked up the 1693 watercourse agreement that he'd found in Carrick's folder and read it properly for the first time, not for the resolution it provided, which he already understood, but for the specific language, the particular way the boundaries had been described, because territory was always in its details, and details were worth knowing. They worked through the morning in the specific, comfortable quiet of two people doing the same work in the same place, and neither of them felt the need to fill the quiet with anything, because the work was filling it adequately, and the quiet itself had a good quality, the quality of a room where someone was paying attention. At the midday hour, Bet sent Wren up with food, bread and cheese and a soup that was better than it had any right to be from what had been in the kitchen that morning, and Wren set it on the side of the table with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this since February, which he had, and said, "Lady Sable, Bet says to eat properly," with a severity that suggested he was delivering the instruction verbatim. Sable said, "Tell Bet I will," without looking up from what she was reading. Wren looked at Aldrich with the uncomplicated evaluation of a 14-year-old assessing an unfamiliar adult. Then, apparently satisfied by something he'd found, he went back down the stairs. Aldrich looked at the soup, looked at Sable, still reading, pushed the bread in her direction. She took a piece without looking up. He took a piece himself. 8. Read the watercourse agreement's second clause, which had a specific term about seasonal flow measurement that he hadn't noticed the first time through. Outside, the May afternoon went on. The territory went on. All of it, the southeastern valley and the eastern tributary, and the county records they hadn't read yet, and the Sunday dinners they were now going to have 12 to 18 of with him at the table learning the names. All of it was out there, and all of it was in here too, in the archive and the maps and the documents that had been sitting misfiled for 50 and 100 and 130 years, waiting for someone to come along who had time and thoroughness and the particular conviction that problems which could be fixed should be fixed. He had been governing a territory for 6 years. He had been doing it, as far as he could tell, adequately. He thought that adequate was probably not the right ceiling. He thought about Nessa's letter in March, before you arrived to find it completely unrecognizable. He had arrived, and it was not unrecognizable. It was simply more itself than it had been, which was different, and which he now understood, was the result of someone caring about a place with enough consistency and enough attention that the place began to reflect that care back. He could do that. He was, it turned out, here. He was staying. The parliamentary apparatus could be reorganized. Godric had been right about that for years, and Aldrich had been wrong to deflect, and being wrong about a thing was only useful if you stopped being wrong about it. He turned the page of the 1693 agreement and kept reading, and the library held them both in the comfortable quiet of a room that was being used for exactly what it was for. It was, he thought, a reasonable way to begin. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed this story. If you liked it, feel free to check out our other videos or YouTube channels where you can find more interesting stories. Your feedback in the comments means a lot to us.